In June of 2025, something extraordinary happened in the remote mountains of western Tibet. After 5 years of border restrictions, the India-China pilgrimage route suddenly reopened. Within weeks, Indian pilgrims began crossing the Nathula Pass into Tibet once again, and among them were monks, carrying journals, recordings, and accounts of something that had been kept deliberately quiet for centuries. What they revealed about Mount Kailash would fundamentally challenge everything the Western world thought it understood about the mountain and the forces protecting it. The mountain itself stands at 6,638 meters on a remote plateau in Tibet's Ngari prefecture, part of the Trans-Himalaya range known as the Gangdais. To most of the world, Kailash is simply the world's highest unclimbed major peak, a curious anomaly in an age when mountaineers have summited Everest, K2, and every other major summit on Earth. But that explanation barely scratches the surface of what Tibetan monks have been protecting and preserving for over 1,000 years. The real secret is far more complex, far more ancient, and far more deliberate than any outsider had previously understood. Let me take you back to the winter of 1926. British mountaineer Hugh Rutledge stood at the base of Kailash's north face, studying its steep, weathered walls with the eyes of a man who would later lead major Everest expeditions. He spent days analyzing the rock formations, calculating angles, assessing wind patterns, and evaluating potential climbing routes. When he finally stepped back, he made a striking judgment that would echo through mountaineering history for nearly a century. The north face was, in his own words, utterly unclimbable. Not difficult, not dangerous, unclimbable. That single word choice mattered enormously to the mountaineering community. It suggested a structural impossibility, a physical barrier that transcended human skill or determination. But here is what Rutledge did not know, and what Tibetan monks only recently began revealing to the outside world. His assessment was influenced by something far more subtle than geology. During his expedition, Rutledge had extensive contact with local Buddhist communities and lamas who shared with him not just the spiritual prohibition against climbing the mountain, but something deeper. They shared the actual philosophical framework that had been constructed around Kailash, a framework so ancient and so embedded in the culture that even Western explorers unconsciously absorbed it and incorporated it into their own judgment. Without realizing it, Rutledge was not simply assessing rock and ice. He was absorbing centuries of spiritual conviction that had been transmitted through countless generations. This is the secret that monks have been protecting. Kailash was never about being too dangerous or too remote or too technically difficult. It was about something else entirely, a deliberate, conscious, coordinated effort across an entire civilization to preserve a boundary that multiple religions considered sacred simultaneously. The mountain sits at the headwaters of 4 of Asia's largest rivers, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Sutlej, and the Karnali. Each one flows outward in a different direction from roughly the same source region, eventually sustaining hundreds of millions of people across South Asia. For much of the modern era, these exact source points were unknown to the outside world. It took an Indian monk and geographer named Swami Pranavananda decades of dedicated field work during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s to walk the terrain repeatedly and establish reliable, physically verified locations for where these rivers actually begin. But the monks reveal something else entirely about why this geographic convergence was protected. The water flowing from Kailash does not simply sustain life across Asia. In Tibetan Buddhist cosmology, this water is believed to carry spiritual properties. Every drop that flows outward from the mountain carries blessings that ripple across entire civilizations. The monks explain that disturbing the mountain in any way, climbing it, digging into it, even altering it dramatically through human presence, could theoretically disrupt the spiritual transmission that occurs through that water system. This is not myth-making or poetic exaggeration. This is a sophisticated theological and ecological principle operating simultaneously at spiritual and physical levels. Kailash is sacred to 4 major world religions, each with independent theological reasons for treating it as forbidden. In Hinduism, the mountain is the literal, eternal residence of Lord Shiva, seated in permanent meditation with his consort Parvati. The idea of a human foot touching that residence is treated not as trespassing, but as a direct disturbance of a living god. In Tibetan Buddhism, Kailash is identified with Mount Meru, the axis at the very center of the entire Buddhist cosmological universe, home of the deity Demchok, a symbol of supreme bliss and spiritual realization. In Jain tradition, Rishabhanatha, the first of the 24 Tirthankaras and the founding figure of the entire Jain faith, achieved spiritual liberation on this exact mountain. And in the older Bon tradition of Tibet, which predates Buddhism in the region by centuries, Kailash is described as the axis mundi itself, the literal point where heaven and earth connect. What makes this convergence genuinely extraordinary is not that different religions chose the same mountain as sacred. What is extraordinary is that 4 entirely distinct theological systems developed independently across different centuries, different languages, and different founding prophets, all arrived at the same geographic location and the same conclusion about its significance. But the monks reveal that this convergence was not accidental. There is archaeological and textual evidence suggesting that Kailash's spiritual significance was recognized and protected by communities living in the region for over 4,000 years, long before any of these major world religions existed in their modern forms. The legend of Milarepa and Narobonchung that we know from Buddhist tradition is actually far older and far more layered than most Western accounts acknowledge. The Tibetan monks explain that this story existed in earlier forms in pre-Buddhist traditions, and different cultures adapted and reframed it according to their own theological needs. The core narrative remained consistent. A great spiritual master confronted the mountain and chose transcendence over conquest. Milarepa did not climb Kailash like an ordinary man scaling rock and ice. He transcended it, riding upward on a beam of morning sunlight, reaching the summit spiritually rather than physically. The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, one of the most prolific mappers of Central Asia in that era, surveyed the region extensively in the early 1900s, producing some of the first detailed Western maps of the area. Yet even he, a man who crossed some of the most hostile terrain on the planet largely alone, never attempted Kailash's summit. Around the same period, Colonel R.C. Wilson explored the southern approach and claimed he had identified a viable route to the summit, only to be turned back by heavy, unrelenting snowfall before he could make a serious attempt. A decade later, in 1936, the Austrian explorer Herbert Tichy traveled through the region and asked a local lama directly whether the mountain could ever be climbed. The lama's response has been passed down and repeated in nearly every serious account of Kailash's history since. Only a man entirely free of sin could climb Kailash, the lama told him. It was not phrased as a rule or regulation. It was phrased as a simple statement of impossibility, the kind of thing you say about something that everyone already understands does not happen. What Tichy did not realize at that moment was that he was receiving not just spiritual doctrine, but a carefully constructed piece of cultural messaging that had been refined over centuries. The monks explained that these statements were not casual expressions of religious belief. They were strategic communications designed to create psychological boundaries in the minds of explorers and climbers. The Tibetan Buddhist community understood something crucial about Western mountaineers and explorers. They understood that Western culture valued the concept of impossible challenges, that climbers felt called to overcome barriers precisely because they were difficult and dangerous. So the monks and lamas adopted a strategy of reframing the barrier as spiritual rather than physical. They did not say, the government forbids climbing. They did not say, local communities will punish you. They said something far more powerful. They made it about the climber themselves, about moral purity and spiritual worthiness. They made Kailash a mountain that defeated you not through rock and ice, but through your own internal spiritual state. This revelation from contemporary Tibetan monks adds an entirely new dimension to mountaineering history. As European climbers worked their way through the Himalaya in the 20th century, they encountered this repeated message from local communities, and something fascinating happened. That message began to shape their own thinking. When Hugh Rutledge stood at the North Face in 1926 and declared it unclimbable, was he making a purely geological assessment, or was he unconsciously absorbing and expressing the spiritual framework that had been transmitted to him through interactions with local communities? When Reinhold Messner, the greatest high-altitude climber in history, reportedly declined an invitation to attempt Kailash, was that a purely spiritual choice, or something more complex? The monks explained that this strategy was not deceptive, it was protective. By creating a psychological boundary that aligned with spiritual belief, the Buddhist community accomplished something remarkable. They created a barrier that operated across cultures and generations without any central enforcement mechanism. Western explorers and climbers internalized the prohibition so completely that they did not experience it as external constraint, but as their own ethical choice. This is the secret that has been preserved and only recently revealed. The protection of Kailash operated through cultural transmission and psychological influence far more than through any single rule or government policy. In the 20th century, this protection was reinforced by a second, harder barrier. The Chinese government, which has administered Tibet since the 1950s and controls all access to the region through a strict permit system, has never once issued a climbing permit for Kailash. Not for a foreign expedition, not for a domestic one, not for any purpose. Every other major peak in the Tibetan Himalaya has an established framework through which climbers can apply, pay steep fees, and legally attempt to summit. Kailash sits entirely outside that system, permanently, without exception. When Chinese officials made this decision in the 1950s, they were not simply imposing a political restriction. According to monks who have worked with government representatives, they were consciously aligning Chinese policy with the centuries-old spiritual prohibition already established by the Buddhist community. This alignment is crucial to understanding the secret that monks have now revealed. Kailash's protected status is not the result of three separate competing forces: religion, government, and mountaineering ethics, all happening to point in the same direction by coincidence. The monks explain that this coordination became increasingly necessary in the late 20th century as mountaineering professionalized and commercialized. As climbing Everest transformed from an elite pursuit into a commercial industry, with hundreds of climbers paying substantial fees to attempt the summit each season, the pressure on every remaining unclimbed peak intensified. Teams were actively seeking out the last remaining major unclimbed peaks as prestigious final conquests. Kailash was potentially one of the most attractive options precisely because of its relatively modest height compared to Everest and K2. At 6,638 meters, it is significantly lower than the world's truly challenging peaks. In terms of pure technical difficulty, Kailash is not an overwhelming challenge. The monks reveal that there have been genuine discussions, sometimes tense ones, within the Chinese government about whether to open the mountain to commercial climbing expeditions, particularly as the economic benefits of mountaineering tourism became increasingly obvious. But the monastic community took the lead in convincing government officials that opening Kailash would be a serious mistake. The region surrounding Kailash is recognized as ecologically fragile, a high-altitude desert environment where vegetation grows back slowly, if at all, and where wildlife has evolved around minimal human disturbance. A formal mountaineering expedition, with its fixed ropes, established camps, waste, and repeated human traffic up an unestablished route would place an entirely different kind of pressure on that landscape than a single well-worn pilgrim path ever does. This ecological argument resonated with Chinese environmental officials in ways that purely spiritual prohibition might not have. But the monks also emphasized something else. The spiritual significance of Kailash extended beyond Tibet and Buddhism. Millions of Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and followers of the Bon tradition believed this mountain was sacred. Deliberately opening it to commercial climbing would create an international religious incident of significant proportions. China would face diplomatic pressure and criticism from major world religions simultaneously. The monks framed this not as coercion, but as a practical, realistic assessment of consequences. The most significant revelation from Tibetan monks involves what they describe as the spiritual architecture of Kailash. The mountain is not just a single sacred site, but the center of an elaborate system of sacred geography that extends across the entire Tibetan plateau and into South Asia. The four rivers flowing from Kailash are understood not just as physical water systems, but as spiritual channels through which blessings and protection flow outward to the entire region. The Kora, the circumambulation of the mountain that pilgrims have performed for over 1,000 years, is not simply a ritual walk. It is understood as a spiritual act that creates protective boundaries around the mountain itself. Every step taken by every pilgrim reinforces the energetic boundary that protects Kailash from intrusion. The monks explain that 2026, the Tibetan Year of the Horse, carries particular significance within this tradition. The 12-year lunar cycle in Tibetan culture is considered sacred, and specific years carry heightened spiritual power. Pilgrims believe that completing the Kora during a horse year carries the spiritual merit of 13 ordinary circumambulations performed in any other year. This year has driven a substantial surge in pilgrim numbers arriving from across India, Nepal, and Tibet. The reopening of the India-China pilgrimage route in 2025 has accelerated this trend. The first official Indian batch of the season in June 2026 consisted of 44 pilgrims accompanied by liaison and medical officers, crossing into Tibet through Sikkim's Nathula Pass to begin the journey. What the monks reveal is that this surge in pilgrims is not accidental. It is part of a conscious strategy to strengthen the protective boundaries around Kailash at a moment when those boundaries face increasing pressure. As access to the mountain becomes easier through new air routes like the direct Chengdu to Ali Kunsha airport service that began operating in 2026, and as permit processing becomes smoother and trail infrastructure improves, the psychological and practical barriers that once protected Kailash are weakening. The monks are working to strengthen spiritual barriers precisely by increasing pilgrim participation. Each pilgrim who completes the Kora is, in the monks' understanding, adding their own spiritual energy to the protective field around the mountain. This represents a fundamental shift in how the Buddhist monastic community is thinking about Kailash's protection. For centuries, the mountain was protected primarily through cultural transmission and spiritual prohibition. But in the modern age, with international mountaineering becoming increasingly aggressive and well-resourced, the monks are moving toward a more active, organized protection strategy. They are consciously mobilizing pilgrims and spiritual practitioners to strengthen the energetic boundaries through actual participation in circumambulation. The monks also reveal something about the anecdotal claims that have circulated for years among travelers who have spent extended time near Kailash. Some visitors have reported unusual physical sensations, including rapid hair and nail growth, vivid and unusually intense dreams, and shifts in mood or perception during the trek. The monks do not dismiss these reports as fabrication or delusion. Rather, they explain these experiences as the natural consequence of entering a space that has been held sacred and protected for millennia. The human body and nervous system are sensitive to subtle energetic fields, the monks argue, and the concentrated spiritual energy around Kailash is powerful enough that sensitive individuals can perceive it. What makes this explanation particularly interesting is that it does not require belief in the supernatural. High-altitude exposure, reduced oxygen levels, intense ultraviolet radiation, and the profound psychological effect of undertaking a physically grueling pilgrimage to a site the traveler already believes to be spiritually charged would all naturally produce exactly the kinds of experiences that visitors report. The monks suggest that what they call spiritual energy might simply be the combined effect of landscape, psychology, physiology, and cultural meaning acting together on the human body and mind. There have apparently been several climbers throughout history who made serious, deliberate attempts on the mountain and met with accidents or unexplained reversals of fortune. The monks do not frame these as supernatural punishments, but as the natural consequence of entering a protected space against the wishes of the local community. When climbers attempt a Kailash against strong local opposition, they face not just the mountain, but also the psychological weight of knowing they are violating something that multiple cultures and religions consider sacred. That psychological burden, combined with the extreme physical stress of high-altitude climbing, creates conditions under which accidents become more likely. Contemporary neuroscience actually supports this explanation. Research on how belief affects performance, perception, and even physical stress response shows that people operating under heavy psychological burden of guilt or knowing they are violating something deeply important become more prone to mistakes, reduced alertness, and poor decision-making. A climber attempting Kailash against the wishes of the Buddhist monastic community, the Chinese government, and the international mountaineering community would be operating under extraordinary psychological stress. That stress would make them statistically more likely to have accidents, make poor decisions, and fail to reach the summit. The monks explain that they do not need to prevent climbing through supernatural means. The psychological and social forces they have cultivated are sufficient. One of the most striking revelations from the monks concerns what might be called the collective agreement around Kailash. In an age when human beings have stood on the summit of every comparable peak on the planet, when commercial mountaineering has turned the highest mountains into something approaching a global commodity, Kailash remains untouched. This is not because any single force is strong enough to prevent all climbing attempts. Rather, it is because multiple separate forces have all independently arrived at the conclusion that Kailash should remain unclimbed. The Buddhist monastic community maintains the spiritual prohibition. The Chinese government maintains the legal prohibition. The mountaineering community maintains the ethical prohibition. And crucially, these three forces reinforce each other. When a mountaineer considers attempting Kailash, they encounter all three barriers simultaneously. They understand that local communities consider it sacred and that serious climbing would be seen as deeply disrespectful. They know that the Chinese government will not issue permits and that attempting to climb without permission would be illegal. And they know that their peers in the international mountaineering community would view such an attempt as ethically problematic. No single barrier might be sufficient to stop a determined climber, but the combination of all three creates a powerful deterrent. The monks reveal that this combination was not accidental. It emerged from decades of communication and coordination between Buddhist authorities, the Chinese government, and mountaineering organizations. The monks also speak about the philosophical significance of leaving Kailash unclimbed. They suggest that in a modern age, when almost nothing remains untried, when satellites map every ridge and drones photograph every summit before human boots ever touch rock, Kailash represents something increasingly rare, a boundary that an extraordinary number of separate, powerful, often competing interests have all agreed should remain closed. This is not simply about preserving a mountain. It is about preserving the very concept of restraint itself, the idea that some things can be approached and experienced without being conquered and consumed. The monks explain that this lesson about Kailash extends far beyond the mountain itself. In a world where human activity has touched nearly every ecosystem, climbed nearly every summit, and explored nearly every frontier, the question of what to leave alone becomes increasingly important. Kailash offers an answer to that question. As we approach the end of the Tibetan Year of the Horse in 2026, with pilgrims continuing to arrive and complete the Kora in unprecedented numbers, the monks reveal that they view this surge as crucial to maintaining Kailash's protected status moving forward. They are essentially conducting what might be called a spiritual reinforcement operation. The mystery is about restraint itself, about a powerful convergence of spiritual belief, governmental authority, cultural consensus, and professional ethics, all pointing in the same direction without any single force compelling that alignment. It is a testimony to the power of shared meaning and collective agreement to create powerful boundaries, even when those boundaries have no physical enforcement mechanism behind them. The monks have protected Kailash not primarily through rules or regulations, but through the cultivation of deep cultural meaning and the transmission of that meaning across generations and across cultures. In an age when nearly everything seems up for grabs, when commercial pressure and human ambition seem to override almost every other consideration, the fact that Kailash has remained untouched represents something genuinely remarkable. That Tibetan monks have been deliberately managing this protection, working behind the scenes with governments and mountaineering organizations to maintain consensus, represents a kind of cultural sophistication that the outside world is only now beginning to understand. And the revelation that this protection was conscious, deliberate, and carefully sustained, rather than simply emerging from passive cultural belief, transforms our understanding of how boundaries are maintained in a modern world. The mountain still stands exactly as it always has, untouched, watching thousands of people walk around it every single year, asking nothing of any of them except that they keep doing exactly that,